Callan Rhodes stepped out of his vehicle just as the evening sky in Ashford turned a dusky amber. His grip tightened around the handle of his leather briefcase while his eyes scanned the quiet suburban street, its calm facade betraying nothing of the chaos soon to come. As he made his way across the driveway of his modest yet elegant home, the street lamps blinked awake, casting long shadows that stretched over the manicured grass like reaching fingers. It had been another taxing day at the Ashford Institute of Sustainable Design. The intensity of Callan's research, particularly on a groundbreaking eco-infrastructure project, often left him mentally drained. Yet even exhaustion couldn't overshadow the fulfillment he felt from contributing something meaningful to the future of urban living. The scent of rosemary and warm oak greeted him the moment he stepped inside. Callan kicked off his shoes and called into the quiet house. No answer came immediately, but soon Vera Quinn emerged from the hallway. Her smile was tight, lips drawn upward without conviction. Her voice, though calm, lacked its usual warmth as she acknowledged his return. Something in her eyes, fleeting and evasive, sent a ripple of unease through him, though he brushed it off as nothing more than work stress. Real estate, after all, was a pressure cooker of a profession. Settling into his favorite chair in the living room, Callan felt a sudden wave of disorientation. His vision blurred slightly, and he had to grip the armrest for balance. These spells had become more common over the past few weeks. The vertigo always crept in during evenings, never intense enough to panic, but strong enough to concern him. He made a mental note to schedule a physical checkup, but buried the thought quickly as Vera brought out dinner. The next morning, the familiar hum of the research lab welcomed Callan as he arrived early to prepare for a key strategy meeting. His team gathered around a large table in the glass-walled conference room, where blueprints and digital models glowed on display monitors. Their urban redevelopment project had caught the attention of several local officials, and expectations were high. As Callan reviewed his presentation materials, his colleague Jasper Cade leaned in slightly, his brow furrowed with concern. The brief exchange between them was quiet but telling. Jasper had noticed Callan's off-kilter energy. Callan, always the professional, downplayed his symptoms. He couldn't afford to appear vulnerable, not with the stakes this high. The day progressed with little pause. During his lunch break in the cafeteria, Callan found a quiet corner to review notes on funding allocations. Nearby, a pair of interns whispered behind their coffee cups, their conversation barely audible. One mentioned a disturbing video circulating internally, something about a man unconscious during a work meeting. The phrase lodged itself in Callan's mind like a thorn. He felt a strange sense of familiarity but forced himself to focus on his work. The project's future, his career, and possibly the city's environmental future were tied to his ability to perform. That afternoon, Callan made his way to a high-floor office where Emmer Sloan, the division director, awaited him. The tension in the room was immediate and unspoken. Emmer was known for his aloof presence, often multitasking during meetings, and today was no exception. As Callan began outlining key data projections for their green infrastructure rollout, he noticed Emmer discreetly tapping on his phone beneath the desk. Mid-sentence, the dizziness struck again. Sharper this time. His vision tunneled, and the room spun violently. The floor seemed to vanish from beneath him. When consciousness returned, Callan was lying on a leather couch in the office, a dull ache pulsing in his temples. Emmer stood nearby, feigning concern and offering water. He attributed the episode to low blood sugar and encouraged Callan to rest for the day. Though the explanation was plausible, Callan's instincts said otherwise. As he left the office, a flicker of glass behind a potted fern caught his eye. Hidden in the shadows was the unmistakable glint of a camera lens. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. A chill traced his spine. There was a growing sense that what he was experiencing wasn't coincidental. Too many small moments, too many fragmented clues. That evening, back home, Callan secluded himself in his private study. The lights were dim, the door closed. He stared at his phone for a long time before finally dialing a secure number. On the other end, Jasper Cade picked up. An old friend and cybersecurity expert, Jasper had always been the person Callan trusted most when something felt off. In a low voice, Callan laid out the fragments. The recurring vertigo, the camera in Emmer's office, the strange tension in Vera's behavior. Jasper listened silently before agreeing to dig deeper. He warned Callan to proceed cautiously. If someone was targeting him, they might already be tracking his communications. Ending the call just as Vera's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Callan quickly masked his expression. He turned from the phone and greeted her with a composed, if distant, smile. Vera asked if everything was all right. He nodded, the practiced calm in his voice betraying none of the storm inside. As she turned away, Callan faced his computer again, his eyes resolute. Something was happening behind the scenes, something carefully orchestrated. And if they thought he would crumble quietly, they underestimated the wrong man. The following week passed in a blur of unease and quiet calculations. Callan Rhodes moved through his routines with meticulous care, though each step felt heavier than the last. Beneath the polished rhythm of his daily life, something sinister had begun to unravel. He monitored every interaction with a heightened sense of awareness, watching for cracks in the facade of those around him. Jasper Cade had worked quickly. After retrieving Callan's devices for a secure scan, he discovered more than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't just a camera hidden in Emmer Sloan's office. Security footage from the facility revealed disturbing patterns. Emmer frequently tampered with Callan's coffee mug during meetings. Even more disturbing was a short clip that had begun to circulate online in encrypted forums. A man unconscious in a professional setting, slumped over a desk, clearly drugged. The face, barely visible in the dim light, was unmistakably Callan's. The real blow came later. Jasper managed to extract metadata from the original video, uncovering evidence that the footage had been recorded without Callan's consent, likely using the same hidden camera he had spotted. And Vera Quinn. She appeared in the background, her face calm, her presence undeniable. Callan stared at the footage in silence for a long time. His wife and his supervisor, two of the people closest to him, had been quietly dismantling his sanity, one carefully orchestrated moment at a time. The emotional weight hit harder than any data point could quantify. Still, there was no room for collapse. If they had gone to such lengths to destabilize him, he needed to go further in response. Callan began the process of collecting his own evidence. He installed miniature surveillance devices in key areas of his home and workplace, devices nearly invisible, but with high-definition capabilities and encrypted backups. His phone calls became coded, his movements strategic. He documented every shift in tone, every suspicious glance, and every instance of Emmer's subtle manipulations. The most crucial step came when he contacted Declan Hart, a former university friend who had transitioned into investigative journalism. Declan, known for his deep dives into corporate corruption, agreed to speak only over a secure line. The initial details of Callan's situation were enough to catch his full attention. Declan didn't mince words. What Callan had uncovered wasn't just betrayal. It was likely part of a larger network of corporate misconduct. Emmer's association with a competitor, Greencore Industries, had been rumored for months. A deal involving stolen research and a generous payout would explain the urgency to silence Callan before the project reached public approval. The threat was bigger than Callan had realized. But instead of fear, a sense of purpose took hold. There was strategy in his blood now, cold and precise. He asked Declan to proceed cautiously, to collect context, build a narrative, but not to publish anything until Callan gave the word. With surveillance devices now in place, Callan began recording subtle indicators of Vera's duplicity. Her conversations on the phone often ceased the moment he entered a room. Her screen brightness dimmed when he walked by. Even her hugs felt rehearsed. Like scenes in a play, she no longer remembered how to perform. He noted everything in a secured journal. Times, dates, voices, glances. The mask he wore each day, of a cooperative husband and devoted employee, became his armor. Beneath it, his mind remained sharp and calculating. At the Institute, Callan noticed Emmer watching him more than usual, especially during team briefings. The director's questions were vague, his tone light, but there was something predatory behind the politeness. It was clear that Emmer was waiting for signs of weakness, any mistake that could be used as justification for further action. In the quiet of his home office late at night, Callan studied maps of the research center's layout, cross-referenced timestamps, and analyzed interactions. He was building a case, one that would not only clear his name but take down the people who had engineered his collapse. The final step in this phase came when Jasper sent him a package. Inside was a sealed envelope containing raw security footage and a printed report. Jasper had found the smoking gun, several clips of Emmer adding a powdered substance to Callan's beverages, always during private meetings. Even more damning was a moment where Vera entered the lab office, unauthorized, during a weekend, removing a flash drive from Callan's desk and handing it to someone outside the camera's range. There was no longer room for doubt. Callan stared out the window, the city lights flickering like stars over a fractured skyline. Beneath their glow, he no longer saw confusion or fear, only intent. The betrayal had been real, brutal, and intimate, but so too would be the reckoning. Callan Rhodes knew that survival in a game of betrayal required more than truth. It demanded illusion. Armed with evidence and a growing network of allies, he now began the next phase of his counterattack. But to succeed, he would first need to let his enemies believe they had already won. He started with subtle shifts in behavior. At meetings, Callan allowed himself to appear forgetful. He stumbled over slides during presentations, misquoted statistics he once knew by heart, and occasionally paused mid-sentence as if grasping for clarity. These cracks in his otherwise polished persona served a single purpose: to lure Emmer Sloan and Vera Quinn into overconfidence. His plan was working. Emmer, emboldened by what he perceived as Callan's cognitive decline, began openly suggesting that perhaps the project needed a new lead. Vera too changed. Her nervous glances faded, replaced by smug silence. At home, she grew bolder in her secrecy, whispering into her phone behind closed doors, deleting messages before Callan could catch a glimpse. She believed the end was near, and that it would be Callan's. But Callan's greatest advantage came unexpectedly. One rainy afternoon, Vera made a call she thought was private. She reached out to Stellan Voss, a well-known private investigator with a reputation for discretion. Her instructions were clear: follow Callan, monitor his movements, and report anything unusual. She voiced concerns about his erratic behavior and hinted at potential mental instability. What Vera didn't know was that Stellan and Callan had history. Years ago, during a separate case involving academic data theft, the two had worked on opposite sides but developed mutual respect. When Stellan saw Vera's name on his caller ID, he contacted Callan immediately. They met the next day under the cover of dusk in an isolated section of Crescent Park. Beneath a wooden pavilion, the rain drumming overhead, Stellan relayed Vera's request. Callan listened carefully, his eyes cold and focused. They quickly formed a plan. For the next 10 days, Callan played the part of a man unraveling. He scheduled therapy appointments, left notes around the house about memory loss, and browsed mental health forums on his laptop, all while making sure Vera had access to everything. Stellan, posing as an impartial investigator, fed her reports that only confirmed what she wanted to believe. Her husband was deteriorating rapidly. The more convinced Vera and Emmer became of Callan's collapse, the sloppier their actions grew. Callan overheard snatches of conversations, references to commitment papers, to final stages, to the apex arrangement. His enemies believed they were one step from total victory. In reality, they were walking deeper into a carefully laid snare. Despite the charade, Callan's real work intensified behind the scenes. Every evening, after Vera fell asleep, he pored over city documents, strengthening the foundation of the Sustainable Development Proposal. His time with the mayor's team was productive, and Mira Halden, the mayor's chief of staff, had expressed increasing interest in Callan's approach to integrating eco-infrastructure with low-income housing. While the conspiracy tried to destroy his credibility, he was quietly becoming indispensable to the city's future. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Rumors began circulating within the institute about Callan's health. Emmer added fuel to the fire by confiding in senior staff that he was concerned for Callan's well-being. Whisper campaigns spread, and minor errors by Callan, intentionally staged, were blown out of proportion. But not everyone was fooled. Jasper Cade, who monitored the digital trail of both Emmer and Vera, noticed a surge in encrypted communications between them. He intercepted fragments referencing timelines, hospital paperwork, and Apex Corp's promised payout. Each new piece tightened the net. Callan's silence during this period wasn't passivity. It was strategy. He was documenting everything, preparing to confront them at the right moment. His disguise as a man unraveling allowed him to observe without suspicion, to record conversations, collect passwords, and trace file transfers without setting off alarms. The trap was almost ready. One final element fell into place when Mira Halden invited Callan to present his revised urban development model to the city's Environmental Advisory Committee. The meeting would be a public event, with key officials and media in attendance. It was a platform that could not only save the project, but destroy the credibility of those seeking to dismantle it. Callan saw the opportunity clearly. The time for shadows was ending. Soon it would be their turn to fall. The grand ballroom of the Langston Hall shimmered under crystal chandeliers, its polished marble floors reflecting the glitter of gowns and tuxedos. It was the annual gala hosted by the Ashford Institute, an evening meant to celebrate innovation and progress. But for Callan Rhodes, it was the battlefield where his months-long strategy would finally unfold. He moved through the crowd with quiet intent, offering polite nods and forced smiles. Around him, donors laughed over champagne, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Near the bar, Vera Quinn and Emmer Sloan stood close, speaking in hushed tones, their heads tilted together as if conspiring beneath the noise. Callan caught their glances, saw the smug confidence in Emmer's expression, the poorly concealed satisfaction on Vera's face. They believed they had won. Earlier that day, Callan had intentionally dropped a few cryptic hints in the office. Mentions of headaches, disorientation, and fears about memory lapses. Vera had been quick to pass them along to Emmer, who seized the moment. The trap was nearly set. Just as planned, a young server approached Callan with a drink, courtesy of Mr. Sloan. It was a golden liquid in a crystal glass, the kind of gesture that seemed generous but carried sinister intent. Callan accepted it with a gracious nod, then, in one smooth motion, swapped it with another glass from the tray. "Actually," he said to the waiter with a subtle smile, "deliver this one to Mr. Sloan, a toast to our shared success." The waiter nodded and crossed the floor. Moments later, Emmer raised the glass in a mock salute, unaware of what he held. Within minutes, Callan watched as the effects took hold. Emmer's face flushed red, his movements lost coordination, and he stumbled into a passing guest, drawing attention from the surrounding crowd. He climbed onto the stage, just as the Institute's CEO approached the microphone. "I've got something to say," Emmer blurted, his voice slurred. He swayed slightly as he pointed toward Callan. "You all think he's some kind of visionary, but he's unstable. A fraud." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Gasps echoed across the crowd. Callan stepped forward slowly, a folder in hand. His voice, when it came, was calm and clear. "I think that's quite enough." He turned to the crowd, scanning the faces, investors, city officials, members of the press. "For months, I've endured a calculated attempt to sabotage not only my career, but my reputation and my health. Tonight, I'll share the truth." He opened the folder and began distributing documents, photocopies of internal emails, financial records, and annotated screenshots. At the same time, a projection screen behind him lit up. The images were damning. Emmer secretly adding substances to drinks, Vera accessing restricted files, encrypted messages referencing deals with Apex Corporation. Shock spread like wildfire. A few members of the board stood in disbelief. Others looked furious. Callan's voice never faltered. "This wasn't just betrayal. It was an attack on this institute's integrity and the work we do for our community. And I refuse to let that go unanswered." As murmurs filled the room, Vera turned to slip away. But Callan anticipated that, too. "And let's not overlook the role played by my wife, Vera Quinn." Her name halted her retreat. She froze mid-step, every eye turning to her as Callan detailed her involvement. The deception, the manipulated video, the plan to have him committed to a psychiatric facility. The aftermath came fast. By morning, Emmer Sloan had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Vera's access to the Institute's systems was revoked. Their reputations, once carefully curated, were crumbling in public view. Later that day, Callan sat across from Mira Halden in a quiet office overlooking the city. The chaos of the night before still lingered in headlines and office whispers. Mira, however, had already moved ahead. In light of everything, the mayor and I believe you should lead the city's new sustainability task force, she said. You'll have full authority to implement your urban initiatives. Callan accepted with a nod, though his expression remained unreadable. Victory, after all, was never as clean as people imagined. The cost had been high. That evening, back in his apartment, Callan stood by the window watching the lights flicker across Ashford's skyline. Somewhere out there, Vera and Emmer were scrambling, desperate to regain control. But they were no longer threats. They were remnants of a war already lost. Callan turned from the window and returned to his desk. There was still work to do, a future to build. But tonight, for the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. 6 months had passed since the scandal that had rocked the Ashford Institute. Time had a way of dulling the public's attention, but for those at the center of it, the aftershocks lingered. Emmer Sloan, once the face of the Environmental Research Division, now sat in a federal prison, serving a 20-year sentence without parole. The charges, corporate espionage, fraud, and attempted poisoning, had left no room for doubt. Stripped of his titles and influence, he spent his days in isolation, a stark contrast to the luxury he once flaunted. Vera Quinn's fate had been only slightly less severe. Sentenced to 10 years with the possibility of parole after 7, she had watched her world collapse. Her real estate license revoked, her name erased from professional networks, and her reputation tarnished beyond repair. The weight of her decisions hung heavily over her cell in a state correctional facility, where manipulation no longer held power and control had slipped through her fingers. Together, they had lost everything: careers, freedom, financial stability, and were ordered to pay restitution to the institutions they had betrayed. Their bank accounts were frozen, assets seized. What remained was a future defined by consequences. For Callan Rhodes, life had moved in a dramatically different direction. On a clear autumn morning, beneath a banner that read Ashford's first sustainable neighborhood, Callan stood at a podium surrounded by city officials, residents, and media crews. Solar panels glistened atop rooftops, electric charging stations lined the streets, and rooftop gardens flourished with fresh produce. This wasn't just another urban project. It was a symbol of resilience, of rebirth. This isn't just about infrastructure, Callan addressed the crowd. It's about creating a future we can believe in together. Applause echoed down the freshly paved streets. Behind the cameras, familiar faces watched proudly. Jasper Cade stood near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, nodding quietly. Next to him was Declan Hart, the journalist whose investigative work had helped bring everything to light. Together, they had formed an unlikely alliance: scientist, hacker, and reporter, united by truth and accountability. Callan's work with the city had expanded rapidly. After accepting Mira Halden's offer to lead Ashford's sustainability task force, he had worked tirelessly with the mayor's office to reshape environmental policies, improve transparency, and push legislation that held private companies to higher standards. His testimony before state and federal committees had sparked broader conversations, leading to sweeping changes in environmental compliance across multiple cities. But not everything was political. Some changes were deeply personal. Though the betrayal he'd endured had left lasting scars, Callan had begun healing. He'd reconnected with old friends, cautiously started dating again, and rediscovered a sense of peace in the small routines. Morning coffee on the balcony, long walks through city parks, weekends spent sketching design ideas on napkins and notebooks. He hadn't seen Vera since the sentencing. Her appeals had been denied, her letters returned unread. Callan wasn't interested in revenge. What he had wanted, what he had fought for, was truth, safety, and the freedom to build something meaningful without fear of sabotage. And he had all three now. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony concluded, Mayor Everett Kane took the stage, shaking Callan's hand with genuine admiration. "This city owes you more than it can express," he said. "Your vision has become our reality." Later that day, Callan found a quiet moment in his office. The sun dipped low across the skyline, casting warm gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the distance, the courthouse stood tall where justice had been served. And not far from it, the new eco-district thrived, living proof of what could emerge from devastation. His phone buzzed. A message from Mira. "Great job today. The governor wants to meet. They're considering taking your program statewide." Callan smiled softly and placed the phone aside. He walked over to the window, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the city he once feared losing. He had faced betrayal in its ugliest form, seen the darkest sides of people he once trusted, but he hadn't broken. He'd risen, and now, standing at the helm of something far greater than revenge, he understood the full measure of his victory. It was never about ruining those who had wronged him. It was about transforming pain into purpose, about showing that resilience, when matched with courage and vision, could rebuild not only a life, but a legacy. As night fell over Ashford and the city lights flickered to life, Callan turned back to his desk. There were still policies to finalize, new neighborhoods to design, and a statewide plan to draft. The future was calling, and this time he was ready to shape it.